So I'm really not just standing here so you can look at me. We record these programs and I'm waiting for the high sign from our IT guy who just gave it to me. So if there's ever one of these programs that you don't get to come in for, we'd love to have you come in, but they are broadcast on our YouTube channel. So if you, big snowstorm and you don't want to be out, catch it later on the MHS Facebook or the YouTube page. My name is Kirby Lambert. I'm the Outreach and Interpretation Program Manager here at the Society, and this is a great crowd. We got a full house. We have a little overflow out in the lobby if anybody'd rather stretch out on a couch. We have a couple of couches out there. So anyway, I presume have some probably latecomers that'll be joining us out there. Thank you for being here. We're in for a big treat. We have actually two events going on today. We also operate the original Governor's Mansion and Santa. We have one of those old-fashioned crank phones on the wall. And so you can go to the OGM and telephone Santa at the North Pole. We're advertising that as the nice aspect of Christmas, and this is the naughty aspect. So I see what people chose. I'm curious, how many people here remember this? I'm not going to ask if anybody was involved, but I'll ask if you remember it. So, okay, well, great. Well, until this book came out, I had never heard of it. So it's a story that I think is really fascinating and it's a good story. It's definitely a Butte story. So our speaker today, John Kuglin, of course, and I always forget to mention this, but we do have his books available in the bookstore, and our store manager would be delighted to sell you a copy or 10, and John would be happy to sign them after we're done here. So anyway, John Kuglin was born in Chicago and received a BA in history from the Colorado College. He began his long career as a journalist before graduation as a reporter for the Colorado Springs Free Press. Later, he was a City Hall reporter for the rival Gazette-Telegraph. He moved to Montana in 1965, where he was a copy editor and a reporter for the Missoulian and the Independent Record. He was a State House reporter for the Great Falls Tribune and covered the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention. It'd be interesting to know if any of the people that were involved in Butte at the scandal were back here for the Constitutional Convention. So he worked 31 years for the Associated Press in Spokane, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Helena. He retired in 2005 as AP's bureau chief for Montana and Wyoming, and he helped launch the Montana Freedom of Information Hotline, which he chaired for 18 years. It provides free legal advice to citizens denied the right of access to public meetings, records, and the courts. He was the first recipient of the Montana Free Press Award for the Schools of Law and Journalism at the University of Montana, and he received the Jeanette Rankin Civil Liberties Award for fighting for Montana's right to know. And he was inducted into the Open Government Hall of Fame by the National Freedom of Information Coalition and Society of Professional Journalists. He lives in Helena with his wife, Gail, and I'm happy to turn this over to John.
Well, Kirby, thanks for the introduction. So, in 1968, I was a State House reporter in Helena for the Great Falls Tribune. And the editors sent me to Butte to interview a madam who had operated two of the leading houses of prostitution. So, know how much you know about Butte, but half a century ago when I went to Butte, it was wide open. They had thriving brothels, bars open all night, legal gambling, what a surprise. And as a sign off the interstate east of the city says, Butte drinks their liquor straight. My nonfiction book about Butte is titled Montana's Dimple Knees Sex Scandal, 1960s Prostitution, Payoffs, and Politicians. The book was released in June by the History Press. So all the royalties will be paid directly to the Butte citizens for preservation and revitalization, which is working to save Butte's amazing old buildings. So this is the front and the back covers of the book. So the book's about a love story that went terribly wrong, betrayal, violence, greed, and for some redemption. It is based on an 8-part series about Butte that I wrote for the Tribune half a century ago, but 75% of the material in the Butte is new material, in the book is new material. So I spent a lot of time for 4 years going through dusty deed and coroner and court records in 3 counties, a lot of time looking at old files, collecting photos, reading old newspapers, and the Montana Historical Society was a big help. I'm indebted to former longtime Montana Congressman Pat Williams, who's a Butte native, for the book's foreword. So I just thought I'd run through quickly a couple of the photos that illustrate the book's prologue. So the first one, the prologue mentions all the fires in Uptown Butte in the 1970s. So in this photo, firefighters are battling the Diana Hughes fire. And right next door is Newman Bootery. So it was burned out at another location and now was advertising a fire sale when the second fire came. Okay, here's a calendar, thanks to Dave and Crystal Shores. It's of Ed's Back Bathhouse. And this is a 1952 pinup calendar for the bathhouse in Finland. It offers saunas, but only on Saturdays. And of course, later, most of Fintown was swallowed by the Berkeley Pit. So this is me when I was 27 years old. I was a young man then. I'm 4,200 feet under Butte in the Stewart mine. I'm writing about a new telephone system so miners could contact the surface. I interviewed Madam Beverly Snodgrass in the office of Father Joseph Finnegan in Butte's Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, where she felt safe. Snodgrass told me she had been brutally beaten, run out of business when she stopped paying bribes to local officials and the cops. She said she was talking to give a boost to Butte's anti-vice groups. She tried several newspapers, including the one in her hometown, but only the Tribune would touch the story. So I thought this was just a one-shot deal. Quick trip to Butte, interview the madam, write a story the same day, and that would be the end of it. Well, I found a much bigger story than I had imagined. It would take on a life of its own, certainly take over my life, become a major issue in the 1968 governor's race and attorney general's campaign, result in a credible threat against my life, and trigger Montana's last newspaper war. So Beverly made a lot of poor choices. She quit her job as a waitress in Butte to make more money as a prostitute in a brothel 2 blocks up the street from Butte High School. She later bought the house. Beverly was a good businesswoman. A few years later, she acquired her second house, the famous Windsor on Mercury Street. She began a torrid love affair with a prominent Butte official she fondly called Dimple Knees, who stole her heart, and then he stole her money. After she stopped Payoffs, the Windsor was torched twice in 1968. And a few years earlier, there was an attempt to dynamite her first brothel. In an understatement, Beverly said, "I guess you could say that I quit paying off and they burned me out." So after I started interviewing the madam, it was clear that she knew way too much for her own good. Call me Bev, she said. Everybody does. So she looked tired and abused, and she was nervously fingering the lace on her blue check dress. She was tall, red hair. She grew up in West Virginia with a religious family and spoke with kind of a delightful southern twang. She appeared to be in her 40s or early 50s. So if you didn't know about Bev's line of work, someone came into church then, they might think she was one of Father Finnegan's parishioners, and she was there to discuss something like the fall church bazaar. Bev said business was good for several years, and then larger payoffs to stay in business were demanded by cops, politicians, and Dimple Knees and his brother. The brother was the bag man to whom Beverly usually paid extortion money. Bev said she was going broke despite staying open 18 hours a day. Before the payoffs, Bev said she was happy in her work. Talking about her prostitutes, she said, for many of them it wasn't just a house, but almost like a home. She encouraged the girls to join her in taking college correspondence courses. The girls studied during the slack morning hours. So she, jilted by her lover, she's tired of payoffs and being mistreated. The madam hired a respected private detective, and she turned over her records, tax returns, photos, and sworn affidavits by some of her employees. The detective had spent a week compiling the chilling but rather salacious Snodgrass Report. So one of my favorite parts of the report is when the detective and an associate watched in the shadows just after New Year's Day in 1967 as Dimple Knees rode shotgun for his brother Bill, the bag man. He slowly drove his big maroon Pontiac back and forth on what was left of Cat House Row. Inside the Windsor, Bill was collecting most of Snodgrass's gross receipts, $1,000, $300 more than the usual monthly payoff. Dimple Knees later met his brother in a nearby parking lot. Bev said that Dimple Knees stored his extortion money in the trunk of his Pontiac. You can find a copy of the Snodgrass Report at the Butte Silver Bowl Public Archives and at the Mansfield Library in Missoula. So after interviewing Bev, I returned several times to Butte. Once I stayed at a motel close to the houses of ill fame to interview politicians, cops, another madam, and some of Bev's relatives. I did a little bar hopping so I could research the flagrant illegal gambling and other violations in Butte's bars. I can't remember if I expensed my bar bills, however. Among the photos I acquired was one from Bev's sister. The photo showed Dimple Knees standing in front of a Christmas tree and holding Madam's favorite lapdog, her poodle Suzette. The poodle loved Dimple Knees and waited for him every night so he could toss her up in the air. Dimple Knees was dressed rather informally. He had on a tank top undershirt, blue boxer shorts with polka dots, and black socks held up with garters. The editors at the Tribune refused to print the photo. My God, we have some standards, said managing editor Daz Furlong. But they would print a photo on page 1 of Bev. She was in front of the same Yuletide tree and wore a tasteful white dress. The lead corporate attorney for the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, which owned the Great Falls Tribune, cautioned the publisher against identifying Dimple Knees or naming other crooked officials because they hadn't actually been arrested or charged with a crime. So that made the entire series a whodunit, though practically everyone in Butte knew who did it. Bev described in explicit detail how Dimple Knees would take her out in the flats near the Milwaukee Road tracks near the shooting range and other secluded locations where they would have intense sex. Later, she rented a love nest for them to share, but Dimple Knees finally moved back with his wife. But before that, he gave her an engagement ring and a wedding ring, which he said he hoped someday she could wear legally. So after Dimple Knees moved out, Bev said that the official rarely missed coming at night to the Windsor for yet more sex. They took trips using her money to Whitefish where they played golf, made love deeply every night, toured Glacier National Park that year and the following year using her money. As a result of the tryst, Beverly became pregnant and had an abortion. After the abortion, Bev said her lover sent her a card signed Jim, one who knows. So he was a sentimental guy. And Dimple Knees started sending her cards at this point for her birthday, Christmas, New Year's, and ironically, Mother's Day. So I finally finished my series, including an interview with Butte Mayor Tom Powers, who said that Butte wanted prostitution and gambling. His honor's take on houses of prostitution was that if you closed the houses, the cops would have to chase the prostitutes down the streets. The mayor said Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Every city in the United States over 3,000 has prostitutes. So there was a lot of illegal gambling in Butte. There were so many, no exaggeration, there were so many punch boards in some bars, you sometimes had to arrange them to put down a drink. The police chief told me he didn't know of any gambling in Butte, however, including at the Board of Trade. And this was a big gambling den, just two doors down from the chief's office in City Hall. So on the road, Beat Generation writer Jack Kerouac spent a night in Butte in the 1950s. He wrote, "I walked the sloping streets in super below zero weather. It was Saturday night, and I hoped the saloons would stay open long enough for me to see them. They never closed." If Jack had returned to Butte in 1968, he would find that not much had changed. I mean, some bars closed for only an hour or two so they could be swamped out. I don't know if there's still speakeasies in Butte like one I visited in 1986 about 3 a.m. with some Butte friends. This is the sort of place that has no signs, no windows. The door opens on an alley. You knock on the door. The bartender opens a slit in the door, eyeballs you, and if you look okay, he lets you in. So when we finally left, the bar was still full of drinkers. I asked the bartender why he stayed open so late, and he said, "I just like to see people drink." After the series was sent to the Tribune's attorney in Minneapolis, he responded many billable hours with a long list of questions. I went back to Butte again in the fall to find answers, and the series began. And this is the front page of the Great Falls Tribune on October 13th, 1968, when it began the 8-day series about Butte Vice. The Tribune was really the closest thing to a state newspaper in those days. Before the series began, their colorful publisher, Bill Cordingley, had teasers placed on the hundreds of Tribune racks around the state, promising that next Sunday there would be an expose about Butte gambling and prostitution. The publisher hired another delivery truck to haul an extra 4,500 copies of the Tribune every day to Butte, where they sold out during the series. He went at night to the loading dock to be sure the papers were headed to Butte. So here's a photo of Beverly Snodgrass, and she's in front of a Christmas tree in the love nest she shared with Dimple Knees. This is a photo that I took in 1968 of the Windsor brothel that Beverly Snodgrass owned on Mercury Street. Note the free parking sign. This is a great photo. This is a photo of the Butte High School marching band as it parades past the House of Prostitution in the late 40s or early 50s. This is the first house later acquired by Beverly Snodgrass. The brothel is this, see if this works. Yeah, the brothel is this small building here with the railing. The third article in the series was headlined, Butte Madam Describes Love Affair with Politician Dimple Knees. So I was in the Helena bar that night buying drinks for friends after I cashed a $100 bonus check from the Tribune's publishers. You know, $100 was a lot of money in those days, and beer was cheap. The phone rang behind the bar, and the bartender asked if I wanted to talk to some guy from the governor's office. It was Governor Tim Babcock's campaign manager. "The governor wants to see you now," he said. So at 8 at night, I asked. "Now means now," he insisted. And as I drove a mile and a half to the Capitol, I wondered what story I had written that the governor didn't like enough to track me down at night in the bar. The only lights on in the east wing of the Capitol were in the governor's suite. Tim Babcock rose from behind his desk. There was absolutely no color in his face. Babcock, a man of few words, got right to the point. "They're going to get you, John," the governor said. "They're coming over from Butte to kill you. That's all I can tell you. Good luck." So I went home and I began sharing my bed with a loaded shotgun. And 2 weeks later, nothing happened, so I put the shotgun under my bed. And I still look over my shoulder, however, when I'm in Butte, as my wife Gail can attest. As the series continued to be bannered on the front page of the Tribune, the story took on its life of its own. So Babcock was running for another term, opposed by Democratic attorney Forrest Anderson. And he was a rather slick politician, nicknamed the Silver Fox. The two candidates soon tangled over the issue of Butte vice. Babcock said he wanted to clean up Butte, but had no authority to do this. He said this is the Attorney General's job. But Anderson had no plans to sanitize Butte, despite his oversight over county attorneys. The two candidates spent the weeks before the November election issuing news releases, attacking each other over the issue of Butte vice, with copies to the news media. Montana Standard rather viciously attacked the Tribune and Governor Babcock on its editorial page. In one editorial headline, "Why Our Butte," the Standard wrote, "We deplore the whinings of a wielding whore, which had become a political issue in the Montana gubernatorial race. That Tim Babcock has injected himself into a local problem as part of his vote seeking." The Standard said the Tribune has fallen into yellow journalism and smeared Butte. It said the Tribune bent the time-hallowed guidelines of responsible journalism to make a fast buck. The Missoulian, however, later editorialized, at one time, Dimple Knees was the most famous name in Montana. The anti-vice leaders in Butte, meanwhile, continued to criticize the county attorney, police chief, and the mayor for not cleaning up the city. And this wasn't the first campaign against vice in Butte. And here's a group that was against vice, the Salvation Army. And it illustrates the chapter titled Butte Reformers. So just up the street is Walker's Bar, and you can't see it clearly, but this sign advertises Follies. So it's a great place for a Salvation Army band to play. Here's a photo of Father Joseph Finnegan, who was a prominent anti-vice crusader. Years later, he stood trial on child molestation charges, but he was acquitted by a jury. So, anyone know who this guy is? No, that's Evel Knievel, whose friends called him Bob. And he had a reputation for a really tough guy. He once beat somebody up with a baseball bat because the guy said something unkind about Bob's wife. But he's shown in his later years, and he's holding a poodle. In a profile I wrote in 1968 about Bob for the Tribune's Montana Parade section, the stuntman described his youthful crimes. Bob said that when cracking a safe, most people think you just fiddled with the dial. Hell, you just get a chisel and go at it. I can open any safe in 2 minutes. Here's a really unusual photo. Anyone know this guy? He's one time was the richest man in America. He's Butte Copper King William Clark. And in his younger days, he was a dapper dresser. And he's shown in this unusual photo in his later years near a log cabin. He was born in a log cabin in Pennsylvania, but I couldn't find anything else out about the photo that I got a copy for at the Butte Silver Bowl Silver Archives. So meanwhile, the Tribune ignored the standards of tax, kept hauling thousands of papers to Butte. So then these newspapers thought they had had enough. So they sent 2 Cracker Jack newsmen to find Hanky Panky in Great Falls. Unfortunately for them, they arrived 2 weeks too late to find any gambling or whoring, but they were told there had been both until the Butte thing. The Lee reporters, after they had directions, drove by 2 darkened former houses of prostitution at the edge of the city, including one with 2 German shepherds diligently patrolling behind a chain-link fence. The Lee newspapers published their story about Great Falls on the front pages of their 4 papers in late October. Gene Daly was the Cascade County attorney then, and it's believed he lost the state attorney's general's race to anti-vice crusader Bob Woodall because of the allegations about vice in Daly's county. He later was an associate justice on the Montana Supreme Court, however. The day after the Lee story, the Tribune finally rose to debate with a story quoting their mayor, police chief, an unidentified gambler, and an unnamed official, and they all claimed there wasn't any vice talking about in Cascade County. Yeah, sure. Tim Babcock lost the governor's race by a large margin to Forrest Anderson. And a lot of you, I'm sure, remember Tim Babcock. If not, there's Tim, and there's his wife, Betty. And they're in the car demonstrating proper use, seatbelt use. And the photo illustrates the chapter in the book about Butte Vice and the election. Now here's a great photo. And it's in back, it was in back of the 1971 state highway map. And it shows Governor Forrest Anderson netting a large trout. So what's wrong with this picture? If you look at it, Anderson has netted the trout by the tail. And a fish this size, it was supposedly a 4.5-pound rainbow, could easily have just jumped back into the river. The other thing you'll notice is that the fish looks kind of stiff. So I had some friends who worked at the highway department, which put out the state fishing maps, and I later learned that the trout had been taken out of a freezer. It was a little uncertain who caught it, but the governor always claimed he had actually caught it. And I mentioned the frozen catch in the outdoor column that I wrote for the Tribune, and governor didn't talk to me for 2 months. Missoula received collateral damage about Butte Vice. And this resulted in an expose in the Missoulian reporting that illegal gambling was a $20 million a year industry in their county. In Helena, where a popular brothel known as Big Dorothy's wouldn't be abated until 1973, the Independent Record editorialized that in Butte and elsewhere, unlawful activities, be it prostitution, gambling, or after-hours drinking, cannot exist openly and flagrantly unless officials are taking payoffs. The Record editorialized, it's just that in Butte, not only don't they care, they're kind of proud of it. Butte Mayor Powers lost the next municipal election to so-called reform mayor Mike McConey, who wasn't much of a reformer, but he did succeed in stopping the Anaconda Company from dropping the rest of uptown Butte into the Berkeley pit, and he also oversaw urban renewal. I talked to McConey in 2015, where he lives in Nevada, and he said that there was limited prostitution during his time in office and that punch boards in the bars were impossible to get rid of. So the new Attorney General, Bob Woodall, was a certifiable nut with way too much energy. He selected Anaconda as his first anti-vice target, and dozens of punch boards and other gambling devices were seized in 1979, shortly after he took office. He also threatened to raid the legislature because of Super Bowl football pools, which he regarded as a great evil. This photo shows a punch board seized in Anaconda during Woodall's raid. And when I was looking for a punch board to illustrate the book, I really completely struck out by inquiries in Butte and the Montana Tavern Association. So I sent an email to the Montana Historical Society's curator. The next day they took me down in the catacombs under this building, showed me a table heaped with about 20 punch boards, including the one in the book. The Historical Society is a good place to find, well, just about anything. Attorney General Bob Woodall soon became known statewide as Bingo Bob after he said he might raid Montana's churches to suppress bingo, which he also regarded as a great evil. So the zealous Woodall heard that 4 slot machines had been found in the fairly remote eastern Montana town of Circle. and put to good use in local bars. So without telling anybody, law enforcement, he had a team of assistant attorneys general fly to Billings, check out cars from a state motor pool, head in a convoy to Circle, and then they went in and chopped up the slots to the complete amazement of the town's residents. The last chapter of the book, titled Requiem, discusses the deaths of fathers, Beverly Snodgrass, Dimple Knees, and his brother, Bill the Bagman, who extorted money from Butte madams. Like the Tribune series, the book is a whodunit. Dimple's Knees' name isn't revealed until the last sentence of the last chapter. As for Dimple Knees' brother, Bill the Bagman, his body was found in 1970 in a hot pool at the Ranch Hotel Hot Springs near Boulder, midway between Butte and Helena. An autopsy concluded that Bill was very, very drunk. The death certificate signed by the coroner, a mortician from Whitehall, listed accidental drowning as the cause of death, to which I say, yeah, sure. Bev turned her life around. She attended college and was a counselor at a state institution in the Seattle area. She died in 1987 when she was 65. So, because many of you are from Helena, I close with the book's mention of the abatement of the city's brothel in 1973. So throughout the Flap and Butte, and for another 5 years, the well-known brothel in downtown Helena, owned for many years by Dorothy Baker, continued to operate quite openly. Dorothy was a very large woman. Some guessed her weight at 240 pounds. So everyone called her Big Dorothy and referred to her house as Big Dorothy's place, or Big D's. Her house wasn't fancy like some of the old historical parlor houses. And truth be known, it was furnished like you'd furnish a nice house trailer in the 1950s. The house included 2 oversized bathtubs. So here from the Independent Record is a photo of Montana Historical Society interpretive historian Ellen Baumer. She's admiring the ceiling in Big Dorothy's house in downtown Helena, which has been preserved by the Ghost Gallery downstairs. So Dorothy really was a respected businesswoman, a big giver to charity, and admired for running a clean and honest house. Big Dorothy's was usually pointed out by the driver of Helena's tour train, in fact. But in a remarkable interview with the Independent Record, both Police Chief Jack Williams and Sheriff Dave Middlemas claimed they knew of no prostitution in Helena. Dorothy's place wasn't that hard for the sheriff to find. It was 2 blocks down the street from his office. But the sheriff did stop go-go dancing in Helena's bars. While law enforcement denied that prostitution existed in Helena, Dorothy's drew customers not only for the girls, but for her unlicensed speakeasy, which served liquor after legal closing hours. Her house was extremely popular with legislators and lobbyists when the legislature was in session. With the lobbyists picking up the tab, they would make a night of it. They'd close down Tracy's and other legal bars on Last Chance Gulch. This would be followed by a late dinner at 2 good Chinese restaurants. Then it was on to Big D's. When I was working as a reporter for the Independent Record in the early 1970s, two men armed with shotguns were posing as customers. They robbed Big D's and her customers. So the Independent Record reported in a news brief the next day that a Helena rooming house had been robbed, and that one of the robbers had the word Donna tattooed over his left breast. Readers who didn't know what Dorothy did were left to wonder why a robber would take off his shirt to rob a rooming house in winter. The county attorney succeeded in closing Dorothy's. In his filing, he described her house as a place of lewdness, assignation, and prostitution. Police who conducted the raid were accompanied by two reporters from the Helena Independent Record. And the raid was conducted several weeks after two undercover cops were brought in. One was a detective from Kalispell, the other a sheriff's deputy from Missoula. They knocked on Dorothy's door and were met by Dorothy herself wearing a robe. She asked them where they were from, and they lied and said they were from Havre. The cops' affidavits were extremely difficult to find. I found them after going through really big, musty ledgers and stuff, handwritten entries buried in the clerk of the district court's office. And the affidavits from the undercover cops, for some reason, had never been sealed. One of the lawmen said he was paired with Judy, the other Marnie. The detective said he had never been in a house of prostitution. His affidavit said that Judy then offered to explain everything to me and unzip my pants. He said that was to check for VD. The detective said he gave Judy $20 just to roll naked on a bed. The other cop asked Marnie for a list of prices. He had a cheaper date and paid $10 for 15 minutes. He didn't say in his affidavit what they did for 15 minutes, but he gave her a 50% tip. Both undercover cops are named in the affidavits. After the raid, I think Dorothy had a better than even chance of getting her house back after she retained Charles Timer Moses of Billings, Montana's best criminal defense attorney. Among other things, Moses asked for the charges to be dismissed because there had been no search warrant. But Dorothy, who had a history of diabetes and other health problems, died almost a month after police forced her out of her house, which was also her home. Some people think she died of a broken heart. So I'm available to answer any of your questions, and we'll, after that, sign a few books if anyone wants them out in the lobby across from the bookstore. Questions? Yes.